Good morning. Wow, I didn't know I was quite that hot. There you have it. I'm excited to have your attention, though. Welcome to our return to Teilhard. We will begin with a prayer. And if you can't read it, don't worry. I will pray for you. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. We are quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We should like to skip the intermediate stages. We are impatient of being on the way to something unknown, something new. And yet it is the law of all progress that it is made by passing through some stages of instability, and that it may take a very long time. And so I think it is with you. Your ideas mature gradually. Let them grow. Let them shape themselves without undue haste. Don't try to force them on as though you could be today what time, that is to say, grace and circumstances acting on your own good will make of you tomorrow. Only God could say what this new spirit, gradually forming within you, will be. Give our Lord the benefit of believing that His hand is leading you, and accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete. This prayer, authored by Teilhard, is from his book, Hearts on Fire, which is also the name of a prominent essay, but it is in essence the subject which we will be addressing today, the idea of patience and waiting, and specifically for what? What is it that we are waiting for? I want to start just by reminding you that we're looking at Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit scientist, born in France, lived in England, served in World War I, thought and wrote at the beginning of the 20th century in that context, but did so with the theory of evolution as being driven by love. His thought was that we are not only created by God, we emanate from God, but we are drawn to God, and God exists within our every moment, not only ourselves individually, but that of reality, the world around us. And it is that sense of emanating from God, but being drawn by the future, which I want to explore today. And specifically, what does that have to do with church? What does Teilhard's thought have to do with church? We are anticipating Ilia Delio on Saturday, April the 23rd. She will be with us as part of the bookstore speaking series. She is an interpreter of Teilhard. Her work, she is also a scientist with several degrees in pharmacology and a couple of other things that I can't pronounce. But she's a wonderful interpreter, not only of Teilhard, but at least I believe, and others believe, that she is one of the foremost thinkers today of artificial intelligence and theology. What does artificial intelligence have to do with God? So I invite you to write April 23rd on your calendars and reserve that date for Ilia Delio. That's an excellent question. I don't really know. Usually it's a couple hours in the morning, but it'll be in the times, and if you email me during the week, I will answer that question. Does anybody else know specifically? Rick, do you know what time it is? Yeah. So in the morning, and email me or give some specific. 9 to 1, the dean says. If you want to know what's really it is, that's what time it is. All right. The topic she's going to address, which I kind of summarized, is the idea of Christogenesis. It's the rise of Christ is the rise of consciousness, our awareness, the way we see things. Teilhard's basic concept was that that's what evolution is really all about. It's not random selection in the sense of some arbitrary and capricious progression. It is instead the growth of consciousness, our awareness. And that human beings, because we can reflect on our own existence, because we are self-conscious, we're kind of the tip of the spear of evolution, because we have self consciousness. The Spirit, Teilhard says, brings into being what is not yet conscious in a way that divinity rises up and through created reality. You just sit with those words just for a minute. If you're being drawn into the future, how does that actually happen? And what does it feel like? Both from a cosmological standpoint and in your personal lives. And what Teilhard is claiming is that love is the force that attracts us to each other and allows us to become more than we are. It is the force that draws us together, the force of attraction, but also allows us to become more than we are. So in science, we see this all the time with, let's say, molecules. Water is H2O. The hydrogen and the oxygen are drawn together and they make something else without losing their wholeness, without losing their individuality, right? That's what H2O is. And that's the way that evolution progresses. Simple things constantly being drawn into combination with other things to create more complex things. So that's what's happened over time, Teilhard claims, which is very different from some random thing happening that yields a different generation of something. Yes. In what? Here? I think you can think about that simply as the world around you. Created would refer to God's presence and participation in reality. And that divinity is what we recognize. So Teilhard, for example, talks about a consciousness within and a physical structure without everything that exists, stuff, right? So, but these two components, while different, are also in the same stuff, and it is God which is present, right? Which is something we can see and touch and hear and feel, and yet is separate from what we're experiencing. Does that help? We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but think about the difference. Teilhard claims there is a within and a without to everything. There's a within and a without to a rock, and there's a within and a without to a human being. And it is that within which is the consciousness, which is the spirit, through which God acts. Okay, but God is not just a creator who way back in the past made something out of nothing and then stepped aside to watch it grow and develop. God is that creator but continues to participate in creation, is accessible through creation, and stands ahead of creation, drawing creation forward. So you can see that image of God would look more like a power or a dynamis, we would say, and not Abraham Lincoln on the big chair in the memorial in D.C., which is my very first image of God as a child. Right? That with those huge hands draping over the corner of the chair, I thought, clearly this is God, right? The lawgiver, the judge, the one that's bigger and yet distant. But Teilhard would invite us to experience and imagine a God that is, in a way, that thing and yet still present in everything, in all of creation. That's what incarnation means to Teilhard. And that, I think, John, is where created reality comes from. The Spirit, Teilhard says, directs our attention to wholeness, to Catholicity. We've talked about this before. Catholicity is not just the Roman Catholic Church. That'd be a particular part of it. And Catholicity is not just universal, which we sometimes think about, say, in the context of our creed. We talk about the Catholic Church. Some of us learned in school that meant universal. But when Teilhard talks about Catholicity, what he means is wholeness, the connectedness among all things. Everything is rooted together, part and parcel of every other thing. That Catholicity is something that we are part of, we can grow to know, and we can grow to align ourselves with in order to live a fuller life. Society. Now, Teilhard loves the church. This is just his way of talking to all of us about how our religious institutions function. So what makes it a closed system? Hard doctrine that doesn't change. rituals and structures that seem to ground us permanently in the past. An unwillingness to engage culture as it presents itself and change. These things are, if you think about it, part and parcel of almost all of our institutions, certainly all of our religious institutions, which is in part why I think we've had such a difficult time dealing with social issues in the last 50 years, right? Why even today, if you listen to the debates about the litmus test social issues, which I won't rehearse here, typically the religious voice in those debates will often say, we don't let society drive our thinking, right? That's culture, that's secularism, we're different. We have the Bible and our history and tradition, and we're going to stick with what St. Paul said about this as we understand it. Teilhard would claim that that's part and parcel of a closed system. Not that you don't pay attention to St. Paul, not that you agree with everything that's happening in culture around you, but you are engaged with it. You are engaged with it. So as we today struggle with what the church of the future is going to look like, this is something that we ought to take to heart, I believe. What does it mean to be an open system? To be taking energy from the culture around us, to be contributing back to the culture around us, and yet still have some coherence in our being. Launching off this idea of the church as an open system, Teilhard then says we need to have an open theology, a new way of understanding God as part of that system. I love this image of the church. This image of our being together and helping each other as we climb the mountain, if you will. Of having a hand outstretched. What Teilhard would say is that the church, and we would accept this, of course, the church is not there for the benefit of the church. The church is here for the benefit of society, of the world. This is what we say all the time at the cathedral when we're talking about serving the parish and Atlanta and the world. The purpose of the church is to serve the world, not for its own existence. And that drives a lot of how we think of ourselves here, and that would be part and parcel of what Teilhard's talking about when he talks about being an open system. But what does that look like? Remember the lilies of the field story where Jesus looks at the disciples and says, consider the lilies of the field? Well, what if the lilies of the field are not just an image of God and the absence of anxiety, but literally the way we're called to exist as well? Which is to say, in wonder and in the midst of creation. Then, of course, at another moment, Jesus says, and when the disciples are quarreling among themselves about who's the greatest, which is a regular occurrence among the disciples, doesn't ever happen in my life now, but seemed to bother them a lot. Oh, come on, it happens in your life, right? He turns around, remember, grabs a child and says, if you must be like a child in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. We over time have debated what in the world he meant by that, each age tending to adopt a different interpretation. He meant people on the margin, because children at the time were on the margin. He meant, I think, a being that is captivated by curiosity and wonder and awe. There is an open... Children are not innocent, by the way. There was another age in which it was all about innocence. I'm thinking, my mother tells me that was never my issue. Being completely innocent. In fact, my father was a priest, so I went to church all the time. And what I'm told is that when I put me in the nursery, they took all the kids out of, those hampers, they took all the kids' babies out of that and put them on the floor, put me in the hamper. So I was in kind of prison we don't do that here at the cathedral. But I don't think it was about just children being representative of people on the margins, though the church is there for people on the margins. And I don't think it was about being innocent, because I don't think children are all innocent. I think it had something to do with the awe and wonder at creation that children seem to manifest. There's an openness, an undefensiveness, an unguardedness to children that we too can experience, but it tends to take a little bit more work and happen a little bit less frequently. So I love this picture of these two kids looking at butterflies or whatever else they've dredged up out of the ground, just in awe of what is around them, with curiosity that is completely captivating them. And it feels to me like this is a disposition before God that leaves us open. And that in a way, if we as a church were captivated by that kind of curiosity and that kind of awe and that kind of wonder, we too would find it easier to be an open system, taking from culture, maintaining our internal coherence and integrity, and giving back to culture. And at our best, I think we do that. Let me stop there for a moment. Can you think of times when church or the cathedral has been like this? Do you have experiences of that? Where now that you have this concept of an open system, you can say, yeah, we were that then. Anybody got an example of that? I'm sorry, before you start, do we have a microphone?
I think COVID is an interesting example of that, as we didn't have a choice but to be an open system and recognize that there were parts of the world we had to take in. We had to think about how we changed. And in a lot of ways, there were a lot of things that stopped. In a lot of ways, we found new ways to adapt and find different ways for people to engage in the church that we never had created before, that we will likely bring forward with us. Some of those will likely bring forward with us. And so there was a change there based on what was outside that then allowed us to bring something specific and different back out of our system into the world in reaction to that.
Well, thank you. Yeah. It's a great image, being forced into it, whether we wanted to be open or not. There you are. Or hang on, could you, we're going to, because we have an online audience, if we wait to speak in, which is not natural, I appreciate, but then they can hear it. Otherwise, they won't be able to follow us. The entire world is with us now. Go ahead.
No pressure.
I believe it's is it the Easter Vigil? Is that the fire in the morning?
Yeah.
I would say that's very much the waiting for the fire to come up and the calmness and all that. I would say might well qualify for that.
Oh, yeah, that's a beautiful image. Thank you. That is like my favorite service of the year, the lighting of the fire and the coming into church. It's also one of my favorite images of the cathedral. You know, the church is dark when we're coming in with our candles. One year, Robert, who was how old? 4. Remember when they had those sneakers with the lights on them? And so, of course, we've got the cameras running because we're live streaming the service, and it's all dark, except you see these lights coming in through on the camera. It was wonderful. Yeah, we were open to outside influences for a moment there. Yeah. What other images of open system?
So I love the image of divinity rising up through created reality. It's, in my mind, it's like cream rising to the top. I mean, God is part of reality and we're part of reality. And my image is of the church being the same, that we're open to the cream rising to the top. And I think we do that from time to time. And I think one example is the way the church in general has dealt with racism more recently, not so much in the 60s, but more recently has dealt with the issue of racism, the way the church is responding to the crisis in Ukraine right now. Too many times I think the church is hidden, as it did in Nazi Germany, as it appears to be doing in Russia now. And so I'm grateful to be part of a church that is open.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Well, I think of the cathedral in particular and the Episcopal Church as a very open system. So it's hard to kind of pinpoint really specific examples because I don't think that we operate as a closed system in the way that maybe the Catholic Church that you were describing in the 20s was operating. But the thing that I love about the image of the children that you have and the idea of being captivated by awe and wonder is the way that the discipline of being with children and practicing that awe and wonder directs you to what's real so that you're not you're not open to just anything that's trying to come into the system. You're filtering it through this kind of what are we drawn to that really points to God. And I think children do that all the time. Whether they're innocent or not, I do think they're pointing us towards that.
Right. Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I'm just thinking about my first time walking through the doors here. The newness. And then coming with friends and family for their first time here and seeing them look around and go, wow, this is new. It's kind of that new birth.
Yeah, that's a good image. I was teaching a baptism workshop some time ago, and it was on Saturday, and we had, 15 people in there, so let's just say there were 6 couples. And they were all new to the parish. There was nobody who'd really been here, no second children or grandchildren. And so I asked, as part of the orientation and introduction, what brought you here? What did you experience here that you liked? And despite the vast diversity in that crowd of age and positions in life and any other category that we measure diversity, and the very different ways in which they answered the question, they all said the same thing. What it ultimately boiled down to is it felt like home. When we came here, it felt like home. People talked to us, people accepted us, and we were comfortable, right? Which is a wonderful thing to hear. But if you take a step back, one of the things we try to do here on staff anyway is when things are going well, like why? You always answer that question when things are going bad. Let's do an analysis, figure out what's wrong and fix it. But this is a question that we also ask, which is why is it going well? So my question is like, why are they having that experience? It wasn't just a good day because they came at different times. It wasn't just a particular service or a particular individual they met because they came to multiple services and met multiple different people. So what was it that felt like home? And why is it here? Yeah.
It's a very tricky balance to have influence in an open system from the culture without, as you say, having the culture drive the inside. And I think in some cases, in an effort to, maybe out of fear that the church is dying or whatever, that we have to do this, we have to do that, we have to be all things to all people, at the expense of kind of remembering what's at the core of the tradition, the liturgy, good old Thomas Cranmer. So I would say, as a new member of the cathedral, what we've experienced is a very wonderful navigating that course of being true to the history, the tradition, and open, without giving oneself up to please everyone. So I appreciate that.
Oh, that's wonderfully said. I think what we're doing here, while the mic gets back to the back, I think what we're doing here is practicing how to be hospitable in its deepest, truest sense. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, but yes.
The openness is the beauty of this place, I believe. But I do agree with what the lady what she just said. Teilhard was very controversial in the church. I'll have to tell you that, having spent some time in a Jesuit place. He was an extremely controversial character, accepted and not accepted. It was just a tremendously interesting time when we were studying Teilhard. But the openness is wonderful, but you do need to maintain the line, the openness, and when things come in and come out. And I think this lady just speaking before me said it beautifully, that openness is wonderful, but you need to have a line. You need to have a system that you can always return to for strength. It's a balance.
Right. Yeah, I think that's well said. One of the things we often say around here is we try to focus more on the center than the boundaries. More on the center than the boundaries. Any community is going to exist with a series of concentric circles of commitment. There's a core group, there's less, but they're all part of the community. And the Episcopal Church by tradition, but the cathedral by leadership. The dean has walked out, so I can start talking about him now. But the dean's vision, seriously, is we're not policing the boundaries. We're not policing the boundaries. That's true of some of our policies, but it's true of our very posture. We are focused on the center, right? So we're not telling you that this is wrong and this is right. We do believe in the creeds. We do believe in our liturgies. But we don't have a lot of doctrinal law that goes farther and farther afield to tell you what's right and what's wrong. We do think that we are practicing in the liturgies and in our life together how to discern God's presence in the world. And then trying, as Teilhard counsels us, to be patient as we discern as a community what makes sense and what does not make sense. But we tend to focus more on the center or on the roots than we do on the boundaries or even the branches, if that makes sense. It's just a disposition that makes sense in our tradition. To your comment about Teilhard being controversial, Teilhard's writings were banned. They were not allowed to be published, which is a great loss because since they were not published, nobody had a chance to comment on them. So, the big advantage to having a book published really is to draw responses so there's an ongoing conversation, which is where corporate discernment occurs. That could not happen with many of Teilhard's writings because they didn't get around. And he wound up spending the end of his life up in New York, kind of almost forgotten. There's as much more interest now in Teilhard, I think, than there was at the end of his life, perhaps. But maybe we'll learn more about that later. But for your thought, I think part of the core of an open system is the focus on the center and not on the boundaries. That is not how institutions often operate, is it? Where the boundaries are the places where you discern who's in and who's out. And I don't mean to say that flippantly. I mean, think about institutions that you're part of or communities that you're a member of. And the more heavily policed the boundaries, the more intensity there is around identifying who's in and who's out, which we're going to do anyway, but at least we try to have that be less of what's happening here. And so there's more open discussion, fewer things that are doctrinal and cannot be discussed. I taught confirmation. Anybody else want to offer anything before I go launching in another story? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. I do want to say, at least, to be self-critical in the sense of just paying attention, is that we do have some wrong and rights. For example, you're thinking you're right is wrong. Right? So no, to your point, we're not wandering around saying this is the only way you can understand the prodigal of the parable of the prodigal son. I don't even understand it today the way I understood it yesterday. Right? But we do kind of draw the line at whether it's okay not to agree. So we do have these principles that are part of who we are. I think that's right. Well, what I was going to tell you about is teaching confirmation to the kids, which I had a chance to do recently. And I was given an hour to tell them all about the doctrines and belief of the church. No problem there. So I chose the creeds, the Apostles' Creed, to kind of go through. And in doing so, I could just, here's these ancient words which have great power and meaning to us. But if you're not careful, they get to be static and frozen. And the questions become, do you believe in the virgin birth as a biological statement? Do you believe in this or that or the other? And this became apparent to me as I was dealing with the kids, and just drawing them out of that way of thinking into thinking about faith as a dynamic thing, God as a dynamic, pervasive, all-present ground of being, we would say. That is, in which all things exist. And this is a way of addressing it and working into our relationship with it, not ideas about it. So the creed is a guide to participation in the life of God, to acting, to doing. It's not a statement of things about God or Jesus that we've got to decide we agree with or don't. Do you see the difference? The difference between participating in something and having ideas about something. So being an admirer of Christ is different from being a Christian. And being a Christian, as I told the kids, does not require that every day, every Sunday you come to church, when you say the creed, that you actually believe in any particular way those words. The church believes and will believe for you during those periods of time when you either question something or just reject it. Because you're participating in the community is a participation in those Christians who are believing in the sense of trusting. So it's not about having ideas about God as much as it is trusting in God. And real trust requires commitment and a giving of yourself over, a loss of control, if you will. And that, I think, in our spiritual lives is what God is calling us to be. So one way to think about that when you're thinking about your prayer life or just your disposition towards life is, how do you have possibilities? How do you avoid coming at every question with the answer? How do you avoid getting drawn into right or wrong in how you think we ought to react to something? How do you avoid thinking we already know the answer to the question and instead remain in our hearts and our being open to possibility? I've about decided that's pretty much what all the spiritual life is about, is trying to remain open to possibilities, which constantly requires a letting go of what we thought we knew. Right? That's what we're doing with our contemplative practices. I think that's what we're doing when we go to church and go through that liturgy. We are practicing life, the purpose of which is to remain open to possibilities. Yes? Yeah, here. Thanks. Right, you didn't understand. Start again with Eucharist.
Okay. We do the same thing when we take Eucharist, because as children we came to church and we were told I also grew up Episcopalian, and we couldn't take Eucharist because we didn't understand it. We had to go through confirmation before we could. And then one day the church said, we've changed our mind. Actually, now we realize nobody understands it. So come join us and we'll all work it out together. And so to me, that idea of spirituality and possibility, that's what we do. We go to the Lord's table with the possibility that it's important. He told us to do it. We want to do it. We feel closer to him. We know it's important. So the possibility is there. We just don't know exactly the mystery of what is actually happening. And I think that's true in so many things. But I love that example.
No, that's wonderfully said. So I do want to tell you one of the privileges of being a priest is administering the host or the chalice at communion. And I remember one particular Sunday, this, family's coming up and mom and dad are trying to get the kids, there in the right way and get the hands the right position, and the kids aren't really doing it, and it's frustrating mom and dad, and they're kind of anxious. They're getting in the way of other people. You know what I'm talking about. Meanwhile, this 4-year-old, by the time I get there with the host, eyes light up, hands just reaching out, just completely abeam with excitement. Right? And then when I put the host in her hand, she's like, oh, thank you. And mom, is like, oh my God. And I walked by mother and I said, she gets it. She gets it. Yeah, it was wonderful. Okay. So Teilhard talks about the Eucharist as being entangled. We'll talk about that more when we get to quantum theory. The notion of being entangled as a relationship. And the Eucharist leaves us entangled with God, which kind of leads us to the question of what is God? And in Teilhard's conception, God is that force, right, which exists in all of creation, drawing us forward into possibility if we trust it, if we allow God to do that. So I love this image, actually, of this is a depiction of Teilhard's God, the force of love in creation drawing us forward, which in fact is remaking creation as we go and constantly changing our image of God and how we understand that force and its presence and power. So, anybody know what this is? These are rally caps. You know what a rally cap is? A rally cap is what you do with your hat, turn it inside out, put it on your head when you need a big inning. The Dodgers are up and you may need to make that happen. So I had a moment not long ago when a child, which will remain unnamed, was struggling with the realization that certain things this child thought were true might not have been true. Things dressed in red at Christmas and other similar icons, which was somewhat of a shock to this child. And he had a pretty normal reaction upon learning that there were several things in this category, and one of them was, is there anything else you're not telling me? Well, I happened to come down the stairs right as this moment was happening, and so Mary Hunter looked up at me and said, George, is there anything else that you need to tell Robert? And I, thinking I was being cute, said, Robert, who loves baseball and loves the Braves, I said, dude, rally caps aren't real either. And he's like, so I was talking about this recently with a friend of mine, and she said, I think they are real. I was like, really? They are real? She said, not in the kind of magical way that you're dismissing, but think about it. This is a group of people who are joining together with their hopes and dreams, and the mere practice of that, like Eucharist, like other liturgies that we go through, has some effect. It has some relationship with God. Not that God is going to make sure we have a big inning, but that we are moving into something that's larger than ourselves, and in doing so are becoming bigger, and that impacts the world, right? And in that way, rally caps are real. And maybe Santa Claus too, right? So it's an interesting, and I was like, yeah, cool, I'm going to wear my rally cap again. But this is a very pedestrian example, but for me it was very powerful, because as we continue to develop our images of God and think about Teilhard with open systems and cosmogenesis and all these other really highfalutin things, there's some real pedestrian ways where we can learn to discern God's presence in the world. And it's not always finding the wrong to criticize or the solution of some cosmic problem. Sometimes it's just in how we live our lives with other people. It's about proximity and locality and acting in a certain way today. And doing it together in a way that makes us more open to possibility, more loving. And love being that force that attracts us to each other and holds us together. Of which I believe rally caps are a symbol. No, it's not magical thinking. We're not controlling God by doing certain things in a deterministic way. We are instead coming together to be part of something that's larger than ourselves, which actually impacts the way creation progresses. I think that's what Teilhard's talking about. In all of this evolution theory and all the talk about consciousness and its progression, and I'll keep talking about that, it's really as simple as who we are in the moment when together we put on a rally cap, right? Symbolically. So I want to end on that because I want to bring all that stuff back to how we are existing today together as we come into this place, as we go through the practices that over time have demonstrated an ability to open us to the presence of God, to open us to the possibility of a future that we've not yet imagined. And so when we live with those questions, instead of thinking we already have the answers, we are in fact opening ourselves to the possibility of transfiguration, of transformation. But all of those big things happen in very small incremental steps, which we ultimately do when we work together. Yeah.
George, I think a lot of what people talk about, we all, according to our background and experience, have a different spirituality, if you will. And getting beyond just compliance and this whole idea that you can begin to take more responsibility, we believe differently now than we did when we were 25. And the idea that you get beyond the doctrine and you can experience, and people describe it in different ways, but when you come here, you have some business that you want to do. And we all do that in different ways. And I see that being the freedom. Can you use this to grow and go to that next level? And one thing that I experienced, I used to go to the chapel a lot in the early mornings, and over time, like after a long time, I began to be more aware of people around me. And I would think, candidly, well, what's the backstory? Why are you here? I haven't seen you before. And it was very provocative in that way. So I think those are good things that we get from being here. It's hard to admit and accept sometimes, like the challenge of what Jesus taught. I mean, there's some hard teachings that take a lot of time and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to really make something of it and to live that. So I think this is part of it. When I come here, I feel like I've come somewhere where it's comfortable and it's a place where I can do what I need to do. So I appreciate that.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. There's simply no way to improve upon that comment. So I invite you to stand and we'll say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.